Hey everyone, we are out in Hannibal, Missouri today at the Old Baptist Cemetery. As you can see, there is a stone in front of me and all around me that have fallen over. They have not lasted the test of time, but I'm out here with Atlas Preservation and a large group of folks to work for 3 days to get these stones back up and in place. It'll be a long many days here of getting this preservation work done, but trying to get people taught and educated on how to appropriately get these stones repaired, reset, and preserved for the next 100 years.
Like I said, it would be nice if we had a historian that could say this is the oldest stone or this has this local significance. I will say, as we start to clean things and uncover things, names will become available, and some of you are coming at this from genealogy, and I know Wade is involved with that aspect of it, is, you know, researching the people that tell the narrative, tell the story. And this is one of the ways that the social media has really captivated a lot of people and brought a lot of people into the fold of this field, and you just become more interested in genealogy because the way things are available now digitally and the way you can do research and find things in different archives. It is not my specialty. I'm a hands-on guy. I don't do that level. I don't do any of that, but a lot of people that get interested in this are, you know, really good at that, and that's an awesome subject to be able to weave a narrative and find the historical background of many of these people, if there are records. And I would imagine there's some record for most of these people. And the flip side is, if there isn't any record, then the one record is on the stone, and that makes it all the more precious for us to help preserve that stone, because that's all that's left, you know. So it makes the history that's left all the more precious. And obviously the whole subject of this being an African-American site, generally they were separated in most parts of the country. In many cemeteries, there was a separate section within the cemetery, often on lower ground, that was less desirable, sometimes next to the pauper's field. But in many areas, it's just a separate cemetery, so that you know, makes it all part of, you know, the history, how it's, you know, there wasn't adequate funding to maintain these places. Pretty big monument. Also, yeah, that one's fallen, this one is upright. Wow, this will clean up nicely. Now we can look at something like this and say, well, nothing is joined, nothing is bonded. I mean, fortunately it's standing, but when we reset things, we're gonna join all the pieces. I mean, generally you have to start from the bottom and work up. Not always if the stone is upright, like we could actually center and join this piece and then kind of do the reverse, but usually you're building things from the bottom up, and you have to start with a good base. So I think it's more of a balance, that we don't want to do things that are detrimental, that are harmful to the stone, that are impossible to reverse if like a tree falls on it or it needs to be reworked. And so I think there's a different term, that is it reworkable or retreatable might be a better way to think of it, but it's a balance. And so put it this way, you know, museum conservation is something that is in a climate controlled environment, and cemeteries are anything but. So we have you know, high winds, extremes in weather, maintenance equipment, and so it's impractical to have a Puritan attitude about something that is in a very rugged outdoor setting. So here's a highly eroded piece of white marble, and you know, we don't really know why it's so eroded. It has really uneven erosion. I mean, it's actually not in terrible condition up here, but down here it's really bad. It also has the Mason symbol here. You can actually see the date, 1881. It's hard to know why it eroded so badly. We also have the pin situation here, and you can see, so now just by looking at a few stones, we see repetition here. We see the metal split right at the pin point. This actually came from right here. We can just stick it back up there for now. And then it flipped over and just laid there where it fell. Why is this so eroded? I'm not really sure why, you know, if there was something with the geology of the stone initially that made it a weaker stone, quite possibly. You know, was it also at some point aggressively, you know, clean. Maybe not, but anything's possible. But I mean, there's a lot of erosion. There's a chunk missing here because this broke out right at the pinpoint. This is the most common place for loss, which makes this really hard to fix because then there's a piece missing. So how do we even join it together? Even once we can level this base and join this base to this and do a repair on this, still not an easy situation to get this upright. Well, certainly if we can find the piece and we can join it, that would be our first goal. In some situations, it might make sense to square off the bottom so you could get it upright again, but that takes more skill. And I'm not saying that I recommend that, but it might be the only way to get it upright.
Everyone, we are still out here at the Old Baptist Cemetery in Hannibal, Missouri. I have Henry Sweets, the curator of the Mark Twain Museum, and we are in front of the grave of Agnes Flottleroy. I'm not going to pronounce that correctly, but he's going to correct me. So this is an individual that was enslaved along with her daughter here, and Henry knows a little bit more than I do. We are doing conservation work here in the cemetery this weekend, and this is one of the graves that we are going to hopefully work on. We've got a great team of volunteers that are out here working to reset some other graves at the time. But Henry, what can you tell us a little bit about Agnes and her role with the town, the community, her history, and with Mark Twain?
Well, very little is known about Agnes other than what you find written on the stone here. There are several very unusual things that are out of the ordinary. First of all, to find a slave's grave marked as a slave is very, very unusual. I'm not aware of any others around this part of the country that are so marked. Okay. And on this, it says Agnes Flottleroy, slave of Sophia Hawkins. So it identifies her as a slave. The second thing that's very unusual is that in this cemetery, most of the slaves are buried over a hillside here in unmarked graves. So she's buried out here in the main part of the cemetery, which is also a very unusual situation. This smaller marker just has the simple word Petunia on it, and we make the assumption that that is Agnes's daughter. The 1850 census of Hannibal shows that Laura Hawkins, the future Becky Thatcher, owned a 6-year-old slave. So the guess is that Agnes is the mother of Petunia, and that these were slaves of the Hawkins family living in downtown Hannibal.
Perfect.
Well, I do know that Hannibal was a big slave town. In fact, if you could cross that river, you could almost consider yourself free. If you could get to the next town, which was Quincy, Illinois. The 3 men were white out in Rensselaer, which is like toward New London. And they started this church. And I believe they called it the Z-O-A-R, Zora Baptist Church. Okay, but those 3 white people helped the black people to obtain it because black people couldn't own property. And they were slaves, and they built this church on their days off when the master would let them, whatever. And these 3 white people during the Civil War, when the Civil War came, we better not be associating with these white people, with these black people in church. So what we gonna do? Hey, cause you know what, the Civil War ain't nothing about, it's about slavery, so we better do something about this. So they started the Hannibal Baptist Association, something or another, and they became the 5th Street Baptist Church downtown. So the 5th Street Baptist Church and my church, Aiken Center, were at one time one church called Z-O-A-R, Zara. The bottom line to it is, this church was started by, this cemetery rather, was started by a Baptist association, and they were white, and their slaves were also allowed to be buried here. And I was telling her, because she was very sad, because on Flatter Joy's thing, it said something about her being the slave. I told her that's a good thing, because we weren't considered property.
Right.
They just throwed us over on the side of the road.
They named her, they said what you know.
They loved her. In order for them to even give her a headstone, she was family to them.
Special.
Because otherwise they'd have stacked up some stones, maybe put a cross there, you'd have never known she was buried there.
So a lot of time we can go way underneath something with a shovel and then pick this up with the dirt. The idea is now we can come here, you can get your hands under it, and so we do it together and we just go like that, okay? And so this fell recently. This is generally not a good way to block something. It's going to stress the middle. If there's any cracks, that's an issue. So this way is the way we want to go. Most of the oldest gravestones in America are tablet stones, and in the colonial era, pre-colonial era, they tended to be a traditional tablet stone being a one-piece stone, and it just sits in the ground. About a third of the stone, I just say very approximate. When you get into the era of this cemetery, there's going to be a tendency for a lot of these tablet stones to have bases. Some of them had very crude bases that weren't meant to be seen, and so it was a way of using less of the more expensive stone. So these are mostly marble, and the marble had to be brought in from somewhere. It was not generally local. One of the ways to save on the expensive part of the stone, the part that you had to bring in from another location, was to start to put the stones into bases. And so they would use local material, and we saw many of those yesterday out of limestone. However, the earliest versions of those tended to be more crude, not even meant to be seen. They were basically like an anchor underground. I mean, we just got to pull this stuff, rub it out. I mean, it's woven together. But here's the piece of stone. You can fish this out first. We're not going to be joining this at this height. It's not going to be a good end result, but probably goes like that. And this was in a base. You can see the base has failed. Oh, yeah. Look at that. And the base is a local limestone. You got a little keystone there. This is, relatively speaking, not heavy material. You can roll it out of the way. And so you can see it's twofold. It's snapped right where, at the weak point, which is right where it hits the support. Now, additionally, this failed. I'm not sure which happened first. And you saw how far underground. When this was originally set, the fact there's no finished edges on it, it's crude. It might have been right at grade. You might have seen the top of it. It might have been underground by a couple inches, and you might not. It might have been invisible. But this is exactly what I was just describing as a underground vase that's structural, but not cosmetic. And the definition between a rock and a stone is once something has been tooled or worked by a human, then they call it a stone. And so it's a fine line. Sometimes I see something that's just a very crude rock, but then they channeled in, chiseled in the mortise, and then the stone went into it, but it wasn't meant to be seen. And so that way you could use a third less stone approximately. And so you would just see the above ground portion, and so there was not much stone underground. Instead, there was a base. So a lot of times when there was a newer cemetery created, there was some people decided to relocate their relatives, shall we say. So what we did here is we got this pretty well aligned, and because this hole was really big, we then kind of supported the back as kind of a damming, an earthen damming effect, so that we can keep it aligned. Otherwise, we're going to lose our alignment pretty quickly. Not bad. Now with the depth of cut here, I got to spin it and scribe it and hit the other side because I don't have enough depth. It's a 4.5 inch blade, inexpensive diamond blade on a grinder. Long story short of that whole discussion is that when we come upon something, we're not sure what's underground. Now, the other thing is, oftentimes things are broken and reset and lowered, and so as I discussed yesterday, we have a buildup of sediment, especially under trees, and we also have settling, and sometimes things settle a lot because there's, graves, and when the graves sometimes give way, things sink a lot.